On December 22, 1944, Private Palmer huddled in his foxhole near Bastogne, Belgium, watching the frozen ground through a veil of morning mist. His breath came in small clouds that quickly disappeared into the cold air. Then he saw them, 4 figures moving toward the American lines, white flags held high against the grey sky. One of the officers gripped a briefcase tightly under his arm. For 3 full days, roughly 12,000 American soldiers had found themselves completely surrounded by 5 German armored divisions pressing in from every direction. The men were suffering badly. Cold penetrated everything, hunger gnawed constantly, ammunition supplies dwindled with each passing hour. Now the Germans were advancing to offer them a way out. What those approaching German officers couldn't have known was that their next move would spark one of the most pivotal moments in military history. This exchange would lay bare a cultural chasm between 2 armies so wide that it would reveal the fundamental nature of what set American paratroopers apart from every other fighting force on Earth. The real transformation of how the Germans viewed American soldiers wouldn't happen today, but the essence of American airborne culture was already being tested. In just a few moments, a single word would emerge that would define everything and expose the vast gap between what Germans expected and what these American paratroopers actually represented. The German offensive had exploded into life on December 16, 1944, when Adolf Hitler threw everything into his final desperate attempt to split the Allies apart and seize the Belgian port of Antwerp. Over 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks had crashed through thinly defended American positions deep in the Ardennes forest. This surprise assault, which history would name the Battle of the Bulge, marked Germany's last major coordinated attack on the Western Front. Dense forests, rolling terrain, cramped roads, and brutal Ardennes weather had neutralized the Allies' advantage in the air. Hitler believed he could recreate the stunning panzer movements of 1940, when German tanks had raced through these same woods all the way to the English Channel. Among the German commanders orchestrating this assault was General Heinrich von Luttwitz. His 47th Panzer Corps had received a specific mission: capture a small Belgian town that most Americans had never even heard about until now. Bastogne sat where 7 major roads converged like wheel spokes. Every supply column, every reinforcement movement, every tactical maneuver across the southern Ardennes depended on controlling this crossroads town. Von Luttwitz grasped something crucial. Bastogne wasn't simply another town to take. It was the vital nerve center of the entire southern wing of the German offensive. The American forces inside represented a hastily assembled collection of units thrown together by circumstance and desperate need. The 101st Airborne Division, hardened veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, had been resting at Mourmelon in France when General Dwight Eisenhower ordered them to move. The Germans had broken through, and the 101st was his only reserve. Orders arrived on December 17th. Get to Bastogne immediately, no delay. The division climbed into trucks in darkness for a grueling 107-mile journey through freezing rain and heavy snow. They rode in open vehicles with no winter coats, insufficient ammunition, no proper cold-weather gear. Most paratroopers still wore the same jump uniforms they'd had on 6 months earlier in Normandy. Accompanying them was Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, tanks, infantry, and artillery that General George Patton had reluctantly pulled from his Third Army. These armored units had been buying time, slowing the German advance just enough for the paratroopers to arrive. Every hour counted. The first elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment rolled into Bastogne at midnight on December 19th, establishing positions just 4 hours before German forces would have swept in unopposed. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the 101st at Bastogne because the division's usual commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington when the offensive began. McAuliffe was a 46-year-old artillery officer who'd graduated from West Point in November 1918, right as the First World War was ending. He earned respect through solid competence rather than flashy charisma. His men called him Old Croc or General Mac, and they trusted his judgment implicitly. What nobody realized yet was that McAuliffe possessed exactly the right temperament for what lay ahead. He remained unflappable under pressure, stayed practical in his thinking, and possessed a dry wit that would soon become the stuff of legend. McAuliffe arranged his defense with precise calculation. The 502nd Parachute Infantry took positions on the northwestern shoulder to block the advancing 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The 506th established blocking positions at Noville to the northeast. The 501st defended the eastern approaches where the Panzer Lehr Division was already clashing with American armor. The 327th Glider Infantry scattered across the southern and western perimeter. Engineers, support troops, and headquarters personnel filled the remaining gaps. The perimeter formed a rough circle stretching several miles across. Every soldier understood they would be encircled. The real question became whether they could hold position long enough for relief forces to break through and reach them. By December 20th, German forces had completely sealed off Bastogne. The 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, and 26th Volksgrenadier Division squeezed against American positions from all directions. Von Leutwitz's forces outnumbered the Americans by roughly 5-1. The Germans held crushing advantages in tanks, artillery, and sheer numbers. American supplies ran critically low on ammunition, medical equipment, and winter clothing. The weather worked against them too. No aerial supply drops were possible. No close air support could reach them. Fog and snow cut visibility down to just a few yards. Temperatures fell well below freezing. By any standard military calculation, the tactical situation looked genuinely desperate. Yet the men of the 101st Airborne operated by principles that rejected conventional military thinking. These were volunteers who had endured America's most grueling military training. They had jumped from aircraft over Normandy in darkness, then fought in European hedgerows for weeks beyond their planned mission. They had held ground during Operation Market Garden that should have been impossible to defend. The airborne creed, memorized by every paratrooper, declared plainly, "I never surrender though I be the last. My goal in peace or war is to succeed in any mission of the day, or die if needs be in the try." These weren't just words recited by rote. They formed a cultural identity that separated paratroopers from every other military force anywhere. The German attacks grew fiercer throughout December 21st and 22nd. Artillery shells rained down on Bastogne, smashing buildings to rubble. Tank assaults probed the American perimeter, searching for weak spots to breach. Infantry came in successive waves against positions held by outnumbered paratroopers. The defenders fought with whatever they had. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion wielded their M18 Hellcat tank destroyers with devastating skill, destroying roughly 40 German tanks through coordinated ambushes during the siege. American artillery, expertly positioned by McAuliffe, concentrated fire on German formations with remarkable precision despite the desperate circumstances. The 101st had massed 36 155mm howitzers in the town center, capable of directing fire in any direction simultaneously. This artillery concentration represented one of their few real advantages. They could bring multiple guns to bear on German attacks from several directions at once, a capability that repeatedly disrupted coordinated assaults. The Germans discovered that attacking Bastogne proved far harder than their numerical superiority suggested. On the morning of December 22nd, around 11:30 hours, 4 German soldiers appeared approaching the American lines south of Bastogne near Remefosse. The group included Major Wagner from the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmuth Henkel from Panzer Lehr Operations, and 2 enlisted men from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. They carried white flags and a briefcase holding a typed surrender ultimatum on official German stationery. An American outpost from F Company, 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry, intercepted the Germans. They blindfolded them and brought them to the company command post tucked into the woods. The company commander, Major Alvin Jones, read the message aloud, then immediately telephoned regimental headquarters in Bastogne. The ultimatum laid out von Leutwitz's view of the tactical situation and his surrender offer. The German commander noted that Americans were surrounded by strong armored units, that multiple towns beyond Bastogne had fallen to German control, and that honorable surrender represented the only possibility to save American troops from total annihilation. 2 hours for consideration began the moment they received the note. If rejected, German artillery and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions stood ready to obliterate American forces in and around Bastogne the instant the deadline expired. Major Jones drove to division headquarters at the Hout Barracks with the German message. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, acting chief of staff, went into McAuliffe's sleeping quarters adjacent to the communications center to deliver the news. McAuliffe had grabbed brief rest after 3 days of non-stop command decisions. Moore shook him awake and explained the Germans had sent a surrender ultimatum. McAuliffe's immediate response consisted of a single word: nuts. He then asked what the Germans actually wanted. Moore explained they were demanding surrender within 2 hours or annihilation would follow. McAuliffe laughed. The demand struck him as completely unrealistic given what he knew about the battlefield situation. His forces had thrown back every German attack. They had inflicted substantial casualties on German units. Weather forecasts predicted clearing skies within days, bringing aerial resupply and devastating airstrikes against German tanks. Intelligence reported that Patton's Third Army was driving north toward Bastogne. McAuliffe believed his men were giving the Germans a tremendous fight, and these surrender demands seemed completely disconnected from what was actually happening on the ground. Yet protocol demanded some kind of written response to an official military communication. McAuliffe sat with his staff to draft a reply. After thinking it over for several minutes, he admitted he didn't know what to say. The situation was genuinely unprecedented. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, his operations officer, reminded him of his initial reaction. "You said nuts." The suggestion drew immediate agreement and applause from everyone in the room. The response captured both the situation perfectly and McAuliffe's personality. He wasn't known for using profanity. Captain Vincent Vickery, his personal aide, would later mention that General Mack was the only general who didn't regularly swear. Nuts was simply part of his normal speech. McAuliffe wrote down the response and had it typed on official division letterhead. The message in its complete form read, "To the German commander, Nuts, the American commander." Colonel Joseph Harper, who commanded the 327th Glider Infantry, volunteered to personally deliver the response. He located the 2 German officers still blindfolded in the woods under guard. Harper handed them the typed message and explained its meaning in straightforward English. "It means go to hell," he told them. He added that if Germans continued attacking, American forces would kill every German soldier who tried to enter the city. The German officers saluted stiffly, turned around, and left to report McAuliffe's response to their commander. The exchange revealed a fundamental disconnect between German and American military cultures that went far beyond tactical matters. Von Lüttwitz had approached the surrender demand according to traditional European military convention. His forces held overwhelming numerical and material superiority. Americans were surrounded, outnumbered, and faced certain destruction if they kept fighting. According to the established rules of warfare that had governed European conflicts for centuries, accepting honorable surrender terms was both appropriate and expected. Von Lüttwitz believed that rational military commanders facing impossible odds would recognize the futility of continuing and surrender to spare their men from pointless casualties. This wasn't cowardice, but common sense according to centuries of military tradition. What von Lüttwitz didn't comprehend was that American paratroopers functioned according to fundamentally different cultural principles. The 101st Airborne Division had been activated on August 16, 1942, with a promise from their first commander, Major General William Lee. This division has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny. The eagle patch adorning their shoulders symbolized their intended purpose as shock troops, who would strike enemies like lightning from the sky. From its beginning, the division developed an identity completely separate from conventional infantry units. The transformation into paratroopers started at jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where volunteers underwent specially designed training specifically meant to eliminate those lacking the mental toughness required for airborne operations. Physical conditioning exceeded regular infantry standards. Parachute training included deliberate stress, designed to identify soldiers who might panic under pressure. The entire selection process filtered out men who retained any instinct for self-preservation that might compromise combat effectiveness and separated those with absolute commitment to the mission. The silver jump wings they earned represented entry into an elite brotherhood forged through shared hardship and mutual dependence. The way paratroopers dressed their boots was distinctive, nothing like the regular infantry. They wore special patches and insignia that set them apart visually. More than that, though, they carried themselves with a particular bearing, a visible confidence that regular soldiers sometimes interpreted as arrogance. This wasn't by accident. The airborne deliberately built an identity around the idea that they were warriors willing to go places others couldn't or wouldn't venture. Their unofficial motto captured everything, not for self, but for country. This phrase embodied how they saw themselves, men who had volunteered to give everything for missions that conventional soldiers would refuse to attempt. Paratroopers had developed a fundamentally different understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. They jumped from aircraft into enemy territory, knowing they'd be surrounded, knowing they'd be vastly outnumbered, knowing they'd fight without any support. When they found themselves encircled at Bastogne, it wasn't a disaster demanding surrender. It was just another situation, another day, for men who'd already parachuted into Normandy while gunfire erupted beneath their feet. German military tradition understood surrender as an honorable option under certain conditions. Airborne culture had no such concept. Paratroopers learned explicitly that surrender was never acceptable, no matter what. Their creed stated this with complete clarity. I never surrender, though I be the last. This wasn't inspiring poetry meant to motivate troops. It was operational doctrine, the way warfare actually worked for these soldiers. Paratroopers expected to fight until death if required, because the entire tactical system they operated within depended on small groups holding critical positions against overwhelming numbers until regular forces could push through and exploit what they'd achieved. If paratroopers surrendered when encircled, the whole concept of airborne operations collapsed into meaninglessness. The 101st Airborne had already proven this principle in Normandy, where scattered groups, sometimes just 5 or 6 men, held their ground for days against German counterattacks. Surrender or retreat never even entered their thinking. The same culture now operated at Bastogne, only this time across an entire division. McAuliffe's response wasn't theatrical defiance for the press or the history books. It was straightforward communication of a basic cultural fact. American paratroopers don't surrender regardless of what the battlefield looks like. Then, on December 23rd, the weather changed everything. Clear skies appeared for the first time in days. This single shift transformed the entire situation overnight. Allied air forces suddenly owned the sky above the battlefield. Transport planes flew more than 200 supply missions into Bastogne, dropping ammunition by parachute, medical supplies, food, winter clothing. Paratroopers who'd been counting every bullet suddenly had ammunition for sustained operations. Medical teams received supplies to care for wounded soldiers who'd been suffering without proper treatment. Fighter bombers tore into German armor and artillery with devastating accuracy. P-47 Thunderbolts attacked German columns on the roads approaching the town, catching vehicles strung out and vulnerable. The Luftwaffe tried bombing raids on the nights of December 23rd through 26th, but those raids meant less than the psychological impact of seeing American planes dominating the sky. The men of the 101st watched formations of American aircraft and understood that relief had to come. The only real question was whether they could hold the perimeter until Patton's forces broke through from the south. On Christmas Eve, the Germans attacked harder than they had before, throwing their most determined assault against the southeastern sector. The initial German push actually broke through American lines, but McAuliffe shifted reserves and brought concentrated artillery fire down on the penetration, breaking the German assault before it could expand. The perimeter held. That evening, McAuliffe composed a message to his troops that would become as famous as his one-word response. He acknowledged the situation honestly, the cold, the being away from home at Christmas, the weight of what they faced. Then he reminded them what they'd accomplished. They'd stopped everything the Germans threw at them from every direction. They'd identified and fought 4 German panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 parachute division attacking their positions. These elite formations, driving Hitler's final desperate offensive, had been halted by the Eagle Division. By holding Bastogne, McAuliffe concluded they were giving their country and their families the best Christmas present possible while creating something genuinely merry for themselves. The message revealed perfectly the mindset separating paratroopers from conventional soldiers. They weren't victims needing rescue. They were warriors accomplishing something with real strategic meaning. George Patton's Third Army had begun its relief drive on December 22nd, the same day McAuliffe sent his famous reply. Patton had wheeled 3 entire divisions 90 degrees away from their planned thrust into Germany and driven them north through winter conditions that would have stopped most military operations cold. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, spearheaded the drive toward Bastogne. This was a unit with a reputation. Patton called it his most reliable armored formation, needing no fancy nickname because being the 4th Armored Division was credential enough. They'd been fighting continuously since landing at Utah Beach in July. Patton trusted them because they'd performed under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. As they advanced toward Bastogne, German resistance was fierce and determined. The 4th Armored fought through defensive positions, seized towns while repelling counterattacks, and maintained momentum despite mounting casualties and vehicles breaking down. Combat Command A attacked up the main highway from Arlon, while Combat Command B advanced along secondary roads to the west. Combat Command Reserve prepared to exploit whichever breakthrough came first. On December 26th, Combat Command Reserve, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, launched the final push from Remichimont, roughly 6 miles southwest of Bastogne. 13 artillery batteries fired a massive preparation on German positions around Assenois, the last German strongpoint before Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion, with Company C down to just 9 operational Sherman tanks, charged through Assenois in what participants remembered as an all-out assault through heavy German fire. First Lieutenant Leroy H. Booker commanded the lead Sherman, and he drove his tanks straight through, while infantrymen battled Germans house by house. The corridor broke open around 1650 on December 26th. Lieutenant Booker shook hands with an engineer officer, symbolically ending the siege. Armored vehicles flooded through, establishing supply lines and evacuating wounded soldiers. The reaction of the 101st to Patton's arrival revealed something crucial, a profound cultural divide that the Nuts reply had already hinted at. Military analysis described Patton's army as rescuing besieged paratroopers. Newspapers celebrated the dramatic relief. Historians would later credit Patton's maneuver and aggression with saving the 101st from annihilation. The paratroopers themselves rejected this story completely and permanently. At McAuliffe's press conference in Paris on January 2, 1945, he spoke for every defender of Bastogne. He never asked for help, he said. He wanted to make one point clear. They needed surgeons. The distinction mattered enormously. The 101st hadn't requested relief from encirclement because being surrounded wasn't a disaster requiring rescue. They needed surgical teams because the shortage of doctors affected their ability to keep fighting effectively. They weren't asking to be saved from Germans. They were asking for resources to continue doing their job. This attitude seemed bewildering to outsiders who didn't understand airborne culture. How could surrounded soldiers with limited supplies claim they didn't need rescue? The answer lay in fundamental differences between how paratroopers and conventional soldiers understood combat. Regular infantry received orders to take and hold territory until relieved. If surrounded and outnumbered, military doctrine gave commanders guidance about when surrender made sense, when continuing would cost lives pointlessly. The calculation balanced mission against soldier welfare. European military tradition, built across centuries of aristocratic warfare, viewed armies as expensive investments not to be wasted. Surrender became acceptable when situations became hopeless. American paratroopers rejected this entire framework completely. They volunteered specifically to fight where conventional soldiers wouldn't. They trained for missions assuming encirclement and overwhelming numbers. Airborne identity depended on accomplishing what others deemed impossible. Asking for rescue because they were surrounded would negate everything that made them paratroopers. The 101st held Bastogne because it was their mission. They'd continue holding it until ordered to withdraw, or until there was no one left standing. Patton's arrival established a supply corridor, useful for logistics, but the paratroopers never doubted they could have defended indefinitely if necessary. Decades later, reunions of Bastogne veterans featured a recurring statement. No member of the 101st Airborne admitted needing rescue by Patton. This wasn't mere pride. It reflected genuine cultural difference in how paratroopers understood warfare. They'd accomplished exactly what they were ordered to do: reach Bastogne before the Germans, establish a perimeter, deny the crossroads. Mission accomplished. Being surrounded during the mission was operationally irrelevant. Patton's arrival simplified supply lines and let them transition to offense. But the mission would have succeeded without the relief column. To paratroopers, this distinction was everything: the difference between warriors accomplishing the impossible and victims requiring salvation. The former fit airborne identity, the latter didn't. The casualties showed how hard the fighting had been. From December 19th through January 6, 1945, the 101st suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division suffered 533 total casualties. The 4th Armored Division lost roughly 1,000 men, killed and wounded during the relief operation. German losses were vastly higher for no strategic gain. The Wehrmacht threw elite Panzer and Volksgrenadier formations at Bastogne and suffered devastating casualties, achieving nothing. Americans held the crossroads through the critical phase of the German offensive. When German forces finally broke contact and withdrew, Hitler's last gamble had failed. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest single battle American forces fought in World War II, with total American casualties somewhere between 75,000 and 89,000 killed and wounded. The defense of Bastogne represented a turning point where determined resistance by outnumbered forces prevented German breakthrough and bought time for the Allied counteroffensive to develop. The German surrender demand and McAuliffe's reply exposed differences far deeper than tactics. Von Lüttwitz operated from traditions where officers considered soldier welfare when deciding about hopeless situations. Surrender facing overwhelming odds wasn't cowardice, but responsible command preserving soldiers for future service. This made sense in European context, where wars involved professional armies representing national investment. Losing an army meant losing the war, so commanders balanced objectives against force preservation. American paratroopers operated according to completely different principles derived from frontier traditions: volunteer military service and deliberate cultivation of warrior identity, separate from civilian life. These weren't professional soldiers serving for pay, but volunteers who chose to fight in the most dangerous imaginable circumstances. They self-selected for missions where death was likely and survival depended entirely on absolute commitment to mission. Surrender wasn't an option because men who volunteered to jump into enemy fire had already accepted probable death. The mission was everything. Personal survival was secondary. This framework was incomprehensible to German commanders raised in Prussian tradition, where officers bore responsibility for soldier welfare. McAuliffe's nuts reply communicated across this cultural divide with perfect precision. That single word contained multiple meanings simultaneously. It rejected surrender explicitly. It expressed contempt for the suggestion that paratroopers might consider quitting. It communicated absolute confidence American forces would prevail regardless of German threats. Most importantly, it demonstrated American commanders didn't share German assumptions about rational military calculation. Germans expected commanders to calculate odds and recognize when continued fighting became pointless. McAuliffe operated from principles where odds were irrelevant if mission required holding position. The nuts reply wasn't bravado or propaganda. It was straightforward communication that American paratroopers and German panzers were playing entirely different games by incompatible rules. The Germans arrived with overwhelming military power, fully expecting rational soldiers would capitulate when faced with impossible odds. The Americans who held that frozen town brought something entirely different to the battlefield: a cultural refusal to surrender that transcended logic or circumstance. These two worldviews could never be negotiated into agreement. Only combat could resolve them. Fighting raged on for weeks after December 26th, when the encirclement finally fractured. That narrow corridor leading into the town remained precarious, constantly threatened by German counterattacks that sought to pinch it shut. The 101st shifted from purely defensive holding to aggressive offensive operations, pushing outward against the German positions that ringed the town. Villages that had stood empty during the initial German onslaught, including Foy and Neuville, were systematically retaken through brutal assaults in the deep winter cold. The division remained committed to combat until mid-January, when the German offensive had been comprehensively shattered, and their forces began their retreat back across the German border. Yet when paratroopers finally departed that town, they left not as grateful survivors recently rescued, but as warriors frustrated their chase of the retreating enemy was being called off. This mindset permeated the entire division, from the youngest private to the senior generals. The cultural values displayed during those December days were hardly unique to that particular battle. They reflected consistent patterns woven throughout the 101st Airborne's entire combat history. In Normandy, scattered paratroopers had fought for days in small, isolated groups because the idea of regrouping with their units seemed less important than completing their assigned objectives. During Operation Market Garden in Holland, the 101st held positions far longer than the original operation scheduled because their assignment was to hold until relieved, and they would maintain that hold regardless of how lengthy the relief column took. When surrounded at Bastogne by 5 German divisions, the response was identical: complete the mission regardless of what surrounds you. This consistency proved that airborne culture wasn't merely tactical adjustment to specific battlefield problems, but something far deeper, a fundamental identity that shaped how paratroopers understood themselves and their role. Voluntary service reinforced this identity powerfully. Every soldier wearing jump wings had actively chosen this path, fully understanding what it demanded. No one was conscripted into the airborne forces. Those wanting easier service could have remained with conventional infantry units. Becoming a paratrooper meant consciously accepting that you'd fight under the worst imaginable circumstances and that surrender would never be considered possible. This self-selection created units where every soldier held the same commitment to principles that outsiders viewed as extreme or even irrational. The refusal to acknowledge needing rescue became permanently embedded in 101st Airborne identity. Decades later, this principle remained so central to divisional character that it surfaced in popular media. The Band of Brothers television series wrapped its Bastogne episode with on-screen text stating that while historians credit Patton with rescuing the 101st, no member of the division has ever accepted that characterization. They never agreed they needed rescuing. This statement in a popular production demonstrated how thoroughly the cultural principle had been woven into divisional consciousness. Even veterans who were children during World War II and joined the 101st decades after the battle inherited the cultural understanding that paratroopers do not require rescue when surrounded, because being surrounded is the normal operational environment for airborne forces. The attitude transcended specific battles or particular wars to become permanent organizational culture, transmitted generation to generation from soldiers wearing the Screaming Eagle insignia. Press coverage of Bastogne created friction between public perception and how the actual participants understood events. Newspapers celebrated Patton's dramatic dash to break through and rescue the surrounded paratroopers, creating the narrative of cavalry arriving at precisely the right moment to save desperate defenders. This made compelling reading and fit the established pattern of heroic military narratives. The men of the 101st deeply resented this characterization because it portrayed them as victims needing rescue rather than as warriors executing their mission. McAuliffe repeatedly stressed in press conferences and interviews that his division had never requested help and had never felt they needed rescuing. The sole urgent request was for medical personnel to treat casualties, logistical support rather than combat rescue. This distinction seemed unnecessarily fine to journalists and public audiences who naturally interpreted surrounded troops as requiring relief. But for paratroopers, this distinction captured everything essential about their identity and the cultural principles making airborne operations possible. Should paratroopers admit needing rescue when surrounded, the entire concept of airborne warfare would collapse, since small units regularly operate behind enemy lines, expecting to be surrounded and vastly outnumbered. What Bastogne revealed was not any change in German military capabilities or American tactical doctrine, but exposure of an unbridgeable cultural divide between two distinct military traditions. German forces fought according to Prussian military principles refined over centuries, emphasizing rational calculation, professional competence, and officer responsibility for soldier welfare. American paratroopers fought according to frontier warrior tradition, emphasizing individual courage, absolute dedication to mission, and voluntary acceptance of death as the probable outcome. These traditions produced completely different behaviors when facing identical tactical circumstances. German commanders surrounded at Stalingrad had eventually surrendered after an extended siege, because continued fighting became militarily pointless. American paratroopers surrounded at Bastogne never considered surrender because tactical circumstances were irrelevant to mission accomplishment. The contrast illuminated profound differences in how cultures understood warfare, military service, and the relationship between soldiers and their assignments. McAuliffe's nuts reply became one of the most famous military communications in American history, precisely because it captured this cultural principle so perfectly. That single word contained an entire philosophy of military service, separating volunteers who choose dangerous missions from conventional soldiers serving because they were required to. It expressed contempt for enemy threats that assumed American commanders calculated odds like German officers did. It communicated absolute confidence that American forces would prevail, regardless of tactical disadvantages. Most significantly, it demonstrated that paratroopers operated according to entirely different rules than enemies expected. Von Lüttwitz offered surrender terms, assuming rational commanders would recognize a hopeless situation. McAuliffe replied with a word, meaning his forces would fight to the last man, because surrender was never an option, regardless of circumstances. This communication gap extended far beyond Bastogne to represent fundamental differences in how American and German militaries understood combat. The legacy of Bastogne influenced American military culture for subsequent generations. Every paratrooper earning jump wings after World War II learned the story of McAuliffe's reply and the division's refusal to admit needing rescue. The narrative became a teaching tool for instilling airborne culture in new volunteers. If you wanted to be a paratrooper, you had to internalize principles demonstrated at Bastogne, where surrounded men with limited supplies fought elite German forces simply to hold their ground because the mission required holding position. No other justification was necessary, no calculation of odds mattered. The mission was everything. This cultural principle, transmitted through training and organizational tradition, created consistent operational behaviors across decades of service. The 101st Airborne earned its designation as the most deployed division in the United States Army, not through superior equipment or tactical innovation, but through cultural commitment to accomplishing seemingly impossible missions through sheer determination. That culture traced directly back to December 22, 1944, when McAuliffe wrote a single word defining what separated paratroopers from every other soldier who ever fought. The post-war years saw many Bastogne veterans rise to prominence in civilian life and military service. McAuliffe himself was promoted to Major General on January 3, 1945, just one day after his Paris press conference. He continued his Army career, commanding the 103rd Infantry Division in Europe and later serving as commander of United States Army Europe. He retired as a full general in 1956 and died on August 11, 1975, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center at age 77. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery alongside his wife Helen. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, who suggested using nuts as the official reply, rose to Lieutenant General and commanded United States forces in Vietnam. Colonel Creighton Abrams, who led the relief column, eventually became Army Chief of Staff, and the M1 Abrams main battle tank was named in his honor. Countless other Bastogne veterans served with distinction in Korea, Vietnam, and throughout the Cold War, carrying with them the cultural lessons learned in those frozen Belgian forests. The German officers who delivered and received the surrender ultimatum faced vastly different fates. General Heinrich von Lüttwitz surrendered to American forces in April 1945 and spent several years as a prisoner of war. He was never charged with war crimes and lived quietly in West Germany until his death in 1969. Major Wagner and Lieutenant Henke, who delivered the ultimatum under a white flag, survived the war and returned to civilian life in Germany. In post-war interviews, German officers consistently expressed bewilderment at the American refusal to surrender at Bastogne. From their perspective, the tactical situation plainly called for capitulation. That American forces not only refused but continued fighting with undiminished determination represented a cultural phenomenon they could not comprehend within their own military framework. This bewilderment extended beyond individual officers to the Wehrmacht as an institution. German military planning for the Ardennes offensive had not anticipated encountering forces that would fight to the last man in seemingly hopeless tactical situations. The cultural assumptions embedded in German military doctrine, where rational calculation governed command decisions, proved inadequate when confronting American paratroopers who operated according to entirely different principles. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when Allied forces had pushed German units back to their starting positions along the German border. The offensive cost Germany irreplaceable losses in men, tanks, and aircraft that could never be replaced. The final German reserves had been committed and destroyed in a desperate gamble that achieved nothing. For the Allies, the battle represented the largest and costliest engagement American forces would fight in Europe. Yet it also demonstrated the resilience and fighting quality of American soldiers when tested under the most adverse conditions. The defense of Bastogne became the emblematic moment of this larger battle, the point where American determination proved stronger than German material advantage. When historians analyze why the Ardennes offensive failed, they cite multiple factors, including weather, logistics, Allied air power, and German fuel shortages. But the foundational reason was simpler. The offensive required capturing Bastogne quickly to maintain momentum, and the American paratroopers defending that town would not surrender regardless of circumstances. Everything else followed from that basic reality. The mathematics of airborne culture were written not in tactical manuals, but in accumulated decisions by individual soldiers who faced death and chose mission accomplishment over personal survival. Each paratrooper who held position at Bastogne when surrounded and outnumbered reinforced the cultural principle that surrender was never an option. Each artillery crew that remained at their guns, despite German attacks, validated the cultural understanding that weapons were fired until destroyed or victorious. Each medic who treated wounded under fire demonstrated the cultural priority that mission casualties received care, even when personal survival required abandoning position. These individual decisions multiplied across nearly 12,000 soldiers over 8 days of combat, creating organizational culture stronger than any German assault. Von Lüttwitz could threaten annihilation with artillery and armor. He could not break culture that defined soldiers by their absolute refusal to surrender regardless of threats. This was why the surrender ultimatum failed so completely. The German commander approached negotiations assuming rational military calculation. American paratroopers responded according to cultural principles where dying rather than surrendering was the normal expectation of service. No negotiation was possible across that divide. The final assessment reveals that American victory at Bastogne resulted not from superior tactics, firepower, or generalship, but from an unbridgeable cultural divide between armies. German forces possessed overwhelming material and numerical advantages. They should have destroyed American positions through sustained artillery bombardment and coordinated armor assaults, but they confronted an enemy that refused to play by conventional rules. The paratroopers fought with absolute commitment to mission accomplishment, regardless of personal cost. They never wavered despite desperate circumstances. They never considered surrender despite a formal offer of honorable terms. They held their position not because rescue arrived, but because their culture demanded they hold until death or victory. Material superiority proved insufficient against soldiers who refused to acknowledge that superiority as relevant to their decisions. This was the ultimate lesson of Bastogne. Culture can trump tactics. Warriors who accept death as normal cannot be defeated by enemies who assume rational calculation governs behavior. In the end, Bastogne proved that the most powerful weapon in war is not firepower or maneuver, but cultural commitment that transcends tactical circumstances. The 101st Airborne defeated the German offensive through superior culture that defined them as warriors who never surrender. McAuliffe's nuts reply was not theatrical defiance, but accurate communication of cultural reality that German commanders could not comprehend. American paratroopers do not surrender, no qualifications, no exceptions. This principle made tactical calculations irrelevant. Surrounded units continued fighting because being surrounded was normal. Outnumbered units held positions because numbers were irrelevant to mission accomplishment. Low ammunition triggered rationing rather than surrender considerations. Every problem had a solution that did not involve quitting. This cultural framework made the 101st Airborne one of the most effective fighting formations in military history, not through superior training or equipment, but through cultural principles that eliminated defeat as an acceptable outcome. They fought at Bastogne as they had fought everywhere, absolutely committed to mission accomplishment regardless of personal cost. That was why they refused to admit needing rescue. Being rescued implied they were victims. They were warriors accomplishing their mission. The distinction defined everything that made them airborne. They defended that distinction as fiercely as they defended Bastogne because both represented the same truth. American paratroopers never surrender, never quit, and never need rescuing. They volunteered specifically to fight where conventional soldiers would fail. That was their identity, their purpose, and their permanent legacy from 8 frozen days in December when they held the roads and refused to acknowledge that holding was impossible. The Germans offered them escape. They replied nuts. Everything that happened afterward followed from that word, that absolute rejection of surrender, that unshakable commitment to mission over survival. That was the culture of the American paratrooper. That was why they held Bastogne. That was why they never admitted needing rescue, and that remains their legacy to every generation of soldiers who followed.